Multipolarity has arrived, Russia's shift in global political dynamics. Pax Romana, Pax Mongolica, Pax Britannica, Pax Americana. Humanity has grown accustomed to living under the dominance of a single, hegemonic power. Yet, it seems that this habit needs to be gradually abandoned, not in the distant future, but right now. Multipolarity is a political concept traditionally associated with the future. I am pleased to report that this future has already arrived, or at least is emerging almost in real time. In the relatively recent past of 2007, Russian President Vladimir Putin shocked the Western political elite by challenging foundational principles during the Munich Security Conference. I believe that a unipolar model is not only unacceptable but also impossible for the modern world. Not only because such singular leadership would lack both military, political, and economic resources in today's world, but more importantly, because this model is fundamentally flawed, as it lacks, and cannot have, the moral and ethical basis of contemporary civilization. This assertion alone was enough for Putin to be branded an enemy of the people in the eyes of the civilized, read, Western, world. However, the Russian leader did not merely acknowledge the flaws in the current model of world order. He proposed an alternative, a multipolar world. Another quote from his seminal speech: "I am convinced that we have reached a pivotal moment when we must seriously consider the entire architecture of global security. Here, we must seek a reasonable balance between the interests of all subjects of international communication, especially now that the international landscape is changing so markedly and rapidly, shaped by the dynamic development of a number of states and regions." Among the high-ranking Western politicians who listened to this speech in Munich was Robert Gates, then U.S. Secretary of Defense and a noted expert on Russia. Here's how he described his reaction to what he heard in his memoirs published in 2014. "I felt that the bluntness of his remarks gave me an opportunity. Even as he continued speaking, I started rewriting the beginning of my own speech, which I was scheduled to deliver the next day. Consulting with my European Affairs assistant, Dan Fata, whose judgment I trusted, I decided not to respond to Putin in a similar manner, but to use humor as a weapon." In terms of short-term political effect, Gates' approach worked. The reaction to my speech in Europe and at home was unequivocally positive. I received a note reflecting general sentiment from Sir Charles Powell, who had been Margaret Thatcher's national security advisor. He wrote that I had found the absolutely correct tone of biting humor to dismiss Putin and put him in his place. British politicians are known for their such remarks. Take, for instance, Gavin Williamson, a colourful character who was dismissed 3 times from government positions within just 3 years for leaking secret information as Secretary of Defence in 2019, for a complete collapse of work as Education Secretary in 2021, and for misconduct as a Minister of State in 2022. While still in his role as Secretary of Defense, Williamson declared that Russia should shut up and go away. Can we equate the 3 aforementioned figures, Robert Gates, Sir Charles Powell, and Gavin Williamson? No, we cannot. Here is what the then Secretary of Defense did not admit in his Munich speech but did acknowledge in his memoirs 7 years later: "The moment when we were the only ones under the sun, and the arrogance with which we behaved during the 1990s and beyond as the sole surviving superpower caused widespread outrage." Quite a revelation, indeed. However, wait until you see what Gates wrote next, which is even more radical in its assessment than statements by Russian officials even as of 2024, when the World Trade Center was destroyed on September 11, 2001, many governments and people, some publicly, some privately, welcomed the misfortune that befell the United States. In their eyes, the arrogant and omnipotent giant had received its just humiliation. Terrorism is terrorism, regardless of the level of arrogance of the country that becomes its victim. But that's not the point here. The discussion now is about how some particularly forward-thinking Western politicians such as Robert Gates had a premonition of the imminent arrival of a multipolar world. And this multipolar world has arrived, not completely, of course. Historical changes do not always occur instantaneously. This is one such case. Pax Americana, the model of world order where everything is decided by a single arrogant superpower, a phrase, note, not mine but that of a former U.S. Secretary of Defense, has not yet died. It hasn't died yet, but it can no longer function at full capacity. America admonishes China, do not increase cooperation with the Russians. China hears this but continues its course. America implores India, the Russians are bad. Join us in condemning them. Indian Prime Minister hears this but makes his first visit after parliamentary elections not to the West but to Moscow. The West almost decided to confiscate, or rather, to steal, frozen Russian assets. However, as media reports, this intention met with a politely yet firmly articulated ultimatum from Saudi Arabia. Perhaps it's too early to say that multipolarity is in control. But the time has definitely come to say that multipolarity is working. And here's what's already clear. Russia is both the driving force and a clear beneficiary of the rise of the multipolar world. In politics, sometimes it's like business, you invest first and then reap the dividends from those investments. Since 2007, though actually much earlier, such as the strong negative stance of Moscow on the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, Russia has persistently challenged the unipolar model of world order. It challenged it through words and statements, through active participation in the creation and functioning of organizations like BRICS and SCO, and through real actions such as blocking attempts to drag Ukraine into NATO and turn it into an anti-Russia. And now, with a correction, why just now? Since 2022, if not earlier, Moscow is seeing the returns from these investments. And there is likely more to come.